I never thought I'd be the kind of person sitting down to share this online, but here we are. My boss stole my $20,000 bonus. Money I had earned, money I'd been counting on, and he used it to fund his luxury vacation. No warning, no permission, not even a conversation. Just gone. And the way he laughed when I confronted him still burns in my head like a scar. But before I tell you exactly how I turned his smug little paradise into a nightmare he'll never forget, do me a favor, hit like, hit subscribe, because this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about what happens when someone finally decides not to stay quiet. Trust me, you're going to want to hear how this ends. My name isn't important. What matters is that 3 months ago I was on top of the world. I'd just wrapped the biggest contract our company had landed in years. It wasn't just big, it was monumental. 12 months of 70-hour weeks, sleepless nights, endless client calls, and problem after problem that I personally fixed while everyone else ducked out early on Fridays. I put my entire life into that project. When it closed, it didn't just mean money for the company. It meant survival. It meant keeping entire teams employed. And for me, personally, it meant a bonus. A life-changing one. The number was burned into my mind the moment HR told me $20,000. I couldn't stop replaying it. 20 grand. For someone like me, that wasn't just a reward. That was a fresh start. I could finally pay off my student loans. Finally fix my car instead of praying it would start on cold mornings. Finally, maybe, breathe without feeling like I was drowning in bills. I worked harder for that money than I'd worked for anything in my life. And then came the day it all disappeared. I remember sitting at my desk when my boss, let's call him Mark, strolled over with his usual smirk. He was the kind of man who wore $600 shoes but borrowed pens from interns because he couldn't be bothered to buy his own. Always tanned, always bragging about his golf scores, always reminding us he was friends with the CEO, a man who thought rules were for other people. He leaned on the edge of my cubicle like he owned the air I was breathing. "Got some good news," he said, and for a split second my heart lifted. I thought maybe he was going to congratulate me, maybe tell me the bonus had already been processed. Instead, his words hit like a sucker punch. "I've taken care of your bonus. Figured it'd be better put towards something useful." I blinked at him. "What?" He grinned wider, the kind of grin that makes you want to break something. "The Cabo trip. Company needs me sharp, needs me rested. So I rolled your bonus into the expenses. Don't worry, you'll still benefit. A well-rested manager is good for everyone, right?" At first I laughed, because I thought he was joking. But he wasn't. My stomach dropped so hard it felt like I'd swallowed a stone. He'd taken it, just like that. My money, my blood, my sweat, redirected to his all-inclusive oceanfront fantasy. I tried to argue, to explain that it wasn't his to spend, but he cut me off with that same lazy confidence. "Look, it's all the same pool of money anyway. You get a paycheck. The company gives bonuses at its discretion. Don't make this awkward. Be a team player." A team player. That phrase still makes me want to spit. I sat there, numb, while he strutted back to his office, already humming some tune like he hadn't just gutted me in front of my own computer screen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the number, $20,000, floating in my head like a cruel joke. I kept replaying the conversations I'd had with my mom about finally helping her out with rent, the messages from my friends about maybe joining them on a trip for once, instead of always saying I was broke. I thought about how I'd sacrificed birthdays, weekends, even my health for that project. And now, nothing. No reward. Just the sound of my boss laughing on a beach somewhere while I scraped change for groceries. I should have given up then. I should have told myself this was just life, that people in power always win, that fairness is a fairy tale for children, but something inside me wouldn't let it go. The humiliation, the rage, it ignited something I didn't know I had. And as the days passed, as I listened to Mark brag about his upcoming executive retreat in Mexico, I realized I had a choice. stay quiet, or make him regret every single smug word that had come out of his mouth. And that's where this story really begins. When I tell people my boss hijacked my $20,000 bonus, some think, okay, but maybe it wasn't really yours. Maybe it was just a discretionary thing. No, let me be crystal clear. That bonus wasn't just some vague promise dangled in front of me. It was written into my contract. It was the reason I had survived an entire year of backbreaking work without walking out. I work in corporate sales, and not the glamorous kind where you close multi-million-dollar contracts over martinis and glass towers. My side of the industry is the grunt work, months of research, cold calls that hang up before you say your name, proposals torn apart line by line, negotiations that stretch until 2 a.m., with clients who can't decide whether to spend their budget with us or with our competitors. Every deal feels like climbing a cliff with your bare hands, bleeding knuckles, and the constant risk of falling all the way back to the bottom. Last year, our department was on the chopping block. Numbers were bad. The board was losing patience. People were whispering about layoffs. And then, against all odds, I landed the account that changed everything. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a gift. It was the product of 12 months where I practically lived at the office. I learned my clients' industry inside out. I memorized the names of their kids, their anniversaries, their golf scores. I became the guy they trusted to answer the phone at midnight when their systems crashed, the one they vented to when upper management ignored them. I didn't just sell them a product, I sold them peace of mind. By the time the contract was signed, our company had secured 3 years of revenue, stabilized our headcount, and bought breathing room for the entire department. People kept their jobs because I refused to quit, and the thank you I got for that. The agreement from HR that I'd receive a $20,000 bonus as recognition for the deal. I don't think I've ever cried out of relief before. I did that night. I sat in my tiny apartment with its second-hand furniture and heating that rattled like it was haunted, and I just let go. For once, I wasn't terrified about the future. For once, I could plan ahead. That money meant freedom. I mapped it out. $8,000 would wipe out the last of my student loans. $5,000 would finally repair my car. No more praying at every red light that it wouldn't stall. Another $3,000 would help my mom cover her medical bills, for the treatments insurance never seemed to cover. The rest? Savings. A cushion. Something I'd never had in my entire life. You don't understand how heavy the constant pressure is until you feel it lift. For the first time in years, I could imagine taking a breath without debt choking it back down. And then Mark stole it. Mark, with his Rolex watches and his manicured nails. Mark, who never stayed past 5 p.m., unless it was to schmooze with clients at a steakhouse. Mark, who got his job because his college roommate was now on the board. He didn't need the money. He didn't even pretend it was about need. For him, it was about power. I found out later that he'd been bragging about his executive vacation for weeks before I even knew my bonus had been processed. He'd gone into accounting and pressured them to bundle expenses. The company card covered flights, hotels, the works, and when the numbers didn't quite add up, he shifted my bonus into the category labeled performance incentive. He literally rebranded my blood, sweat, and tears into his margaritas and spa treatments. I didn't tell my family. I couldn't. How do you explain that the money you promised to help with rent, with groceries, with life itself, was stolen by a man who already drove a Mercedes? How do you explain that there's no one to complain to because the chain of command ends with the thief himself? So I stayed quiet, at least on the outside. I smiled when my coworkers joked about how nice it must be for the boss to take another beach vacation. I nodded when people said he deserved a break, but inside I was boiling. Every time I saw his name in my inbox, my chest tightened. Every time he walked past my desk with that smug grin, my fists clenched under the table. And every time I replayed the moment he told me to be a team player, I swore I would never, ever let him walk away with what was mine. That's when I started watching him more closely, noticing the cracks in his confidence, the shortcuts he took, the little lies he told to cover himself. Because if he thought I was powerless, if he thought I'd just accept this theft as business as usual, he had no idea who he was messing with. And the irony, his own arrogance would hand me the weapon I needed to make sure his perfect vacation turned into the kind of disaster you only see in nightmares. The conversation that sealed it didn't happen in private. That's what made it so humiliating. It was a Wednesday morning. Half the department was in the break room, sipping coffee, waiting for the weekly update meeting to start. I was already tense because I'd seen the accounting report on my desk the night before. My bonus line marked processed, but my account balance hadn't changed. No deposit, no pending payment. I'd convinced myself it was a glitch. Then Mark walked in, tanned from the sunbeds he visited religiously, grinning like a man who owned the world. He clapped his hands to get everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, quick update before we start. The company has generously funded my executive retreat next week. Cabo, baby, sun, sand, and surf. You know, the works. And thanks to a little creative budgeting, we managed to make it all work without hurting the bottom line. A couple of people chuckled. Most of us just exchanged glances. Then he looked directly at me. "Oh, and special thanks to my rock star here," he said, patting my shoulder like I was his pet dog. "Your performance bonus made this possible. You're sending me to Cabo." The room went quiet. For a heartbeat, no one moved. I felt my face flush so hot, I thought my skin might catch fire. My heart was hammering, my throat tight. He wasn't just stealing from me. He was parading it, announcing it like I'd volunteered to pay for his vacation. Someone at the back gave a nervous laugh. Another muttered, "Wait, seriously?" But Mark didn't care. He was basking in the attention, enjoying the discomfort he'd created. He winked at me like we were sharing some private joke. I wasn't laughing. I managed to croak out, "That money was supposed to go to me?" My voice cracked, weaker than I wanted. Mark just smirked. "Technically, it went through you. Don't get hung up on details. You'll get plenty of recognition in your next performance review. What matters is, the company wins when the leadership stays sharp. And trust me, nothing sharpens focus like Cabo Tequila." The words echoed in my head like poison. He didn't even pretend it was a mix-up. He didn't apologize. He treated my bonus like it was his right. The worst part? Nobody spoke up. People looked at the floor, shuffled papers, took sudden interest in their coffee mugs. Not one person defended me, because that's what power does in an office. It silences everyone. If you speak up, you paint a target on your back. So they stayed quiet while my dignity was dismantled in front of them. The meeting went on like nothing had happened. I sat there staring at the conference table, barely hearing a word. Every time Mark cracked another joke about needing sunscreen or how stressful leadership is, my stomach twisted tighter. By the end, I couldn't even look at him. I went back to my desk, shut my laptop, and sat in silence. The buzzing of the office felt unreal, like I was watching life from behind a glass wall. All I could think was, this isn't fair. This can't be happening. That night, I broke. I drove home on autopilot, barely noticing traffic. When I walked into my apartment, the silence hit me harder than any words could. I dropped my bag, sat on the floor, and stared at my bank account until the numbers blurred. Still no deposit. Just a hollow balance that mocked me. I thought about calling HR, but HR reported to Mark. I thought about going to the CEO, but Mark was his golfing buddy. I thought about quitting on the spot, but quitting meant losing my paycheck, my health insurance, everything I'd worked for. I felt trapped. At one point, I caught myself laughing bitterly. Here I was, the guy who saved the company's biggest account, the guy who'd been promised a future, reduced to a pawn funding my boss's margaritas by the beach. Sleep didn't come that night. I tossed and turned, imagining Mark stretched out on a deck chair, sipping cocktails bought with the money I had sweated and bled for. Each image stabbed like a knife. By morning, I wasn't just angry. I was empty, numb, and that scared me more than the anger, because anger could push me to fight. But numbness, that's what makes people break. Still, underneath that numbness, something was stirring, a small, hard kernel of defiance. If Mark thought he could humiliate me, take what was mine, and get away with it scot-free, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. But first came the hardest part, waiting. Watching him brag, watching him prepare, while I quietly gathered the pieces I would need to destroy his perfect little getaway before it ever began. I had to know exactly how he did it. It wasn't enough to sit there boiling while he flaunted my stolen bonus like a souvenir from the company coffers. If I was going to fight back, I needed facts, details, proof. So I started asking quiet questions. The first lead came from accounting. One of the analysts, let's call her Dana, had always been friendly with me. She knew how hard I'd worked for that contract. When I stopped by her desk one afternoon, I could tell from her expression that she already knew. Her eyes darted to Mark's office, then back to me. "Check the performance incentive category," she whispered, barely moving her lips. "That's all I can say." I thanked her, heart pounding, and left before anyone noticed. Later, after hours, I pulled up the expense reports, and there it was, in black and white. Performance incentive, $20,000. Destination, Los Cabos, Mexico. Notes, executive wellness retreat. My name wasn't anywhere. It had been erased, as if I'd never earned a dime. I stared at the screen until my hands started shaking. He hadn't just stolen it. He'd laundered it through company records so cleanly that, on paper, it looked like a strategic investment. Not theft, not even mismanagement. Just another perk for management. The next morning, I overheard two co-workers talking in the hallway. "Did you hear? Mark's flying first class. Company covered everything. Even upgraded his wife's ticket." I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. My money paid for his wife's champagne, I thought. I could almost see her sipping Dom Perignon at 35,000 feet, while I counted coins to fill my gas tank. What made it worse was the way everyone treated it like a joke. They laughed about how good it must be to be at the top. They rolled their eyes, but nobody said a word that mattered. Not to his face. Not in front of him. And me? I smiled along like it didn't gut me every time his vacation came up in conversation. Because what was the alternative? March into his office and scream? That would have been career suicide. He had the CEO in his pocket. HR reported directly to him. He held every official card. So I played dumb, outwardly calm, inwardly planning. The more I thought about it, the more the rage boiled into something sharper. I remembered the way he'd smirked when he announced it in front of everyone. The way he patted my shoulder like I was supposed to be proud of contributing to his trip. The way my coworkers avoided my eyes, too scared to get involved. I couldn't stop replaying conversations in my head. My mom asking if I could help cover her latest medical bill. My friend inviting me to a concert I had to turn down because money was tight. Me, promising myself that once the bonus came through, things would finally change. Now all of that was ashes, burned for the sake of one man's suntan. It was more than theft. It was betrayal. It was humiliation carefully staged to remind me of my place. And maybe that's what enraged me most of all, not just that he stole from me, but that he wanted me to accept it. For days I went through the motions at work, pretending everything was normal. But inside, I was tracking every step of his plan. The travel itinerary pinned to his calendar. The emails bragging to vendors about his well-deserved break. The jokes in meetings about how the department would struggle without him for a week. I knew the dates, I knew the flight number, I knew the hotel, and as I pieced it all together, a dangerous thought began to take root. If he used my money to build his perfect little getaway, then I had every right to tear it down, brick by brick, drink by drink, sunset by sunset. And the best part, I wouldn't need to lie. I wouldn't need to cheat. All I had to do was use the same arrogance that made him think he could steal from me, and let it blow up in his face. Because the truth about power is this: it only works if people believe you have it. And Mark was about to learn what happens when someone he thought powerless decides not to play by the rules anymore. I wish I could say the plan came to me fully formed, like some stroke of genius in the middle of the night, but the truth is, I wrestled with myself for days. One part of me wanted to curl up and accept it, to say, this is life, the boss always wins, don't make it worse. That was the voice of fear, whispering about bills, insurance, rent. The voice that told me if I pushed too hard, I'd be the one out on the street, while Mark drank cocktails on the beach. But then there was the other voice, the one that grew louder every time I saw him strut around the office, bragging about how much he deserved Cabo. The one that screamed inside me when he called me team player in front of the others, like my humiliation was just another management strategy. That voice wasn't scared, it was furious, and between those voices I broke. Some nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining different scenarios. Marching into the CEO's office and slamming down the expense report. Standing up during a meeting and telling everyone the truth. Going to HR, even if it was useless. Each fantasy ended the same way, with Mark smirking untouchable while I walked out with a box of my belongings. But the thought that kept me awake wasn't about losing my job. It was about losing myself. Because if I stayed silent, if I let him steal from me and laugh about it, then I was complicit. I wasn't just a victim. I was a participant in my own destruction. And that, I realized, I couldn't live with. The turning point came in the strangest way. I was sitting at my desk, exhausted, pretending to work, while Mark bragged to another manager about his oceanfront suite with private butler service. My email pinged. It was my mom. Just a short message. I'm proud of you, no matter what. She didn't know what had happened. She thought I was still on track to get that bonus, still planning to help her with the bills. She just wanted to remind me that she believed in me. And that was it. Something snapped. I wasn't just fighting for money anymore. I was fighting for dignity, for self-respect, for the ability to look in the mirror and not see a coward. But even as my resolve hardened, I knew I couldn't just lash out. Mark had power, connections. He could bury me with a single phone call if I gave him the chance. If I was going to do this, it had to be careful, precise, something that looked like natural consequences, not sabotage. So I started planning in silence. I studied his travel itinerary, memorizing flight numbers and hotel confirmation codes. He wasn't careful. Why would he be? He'd left the details pinned to his corkboard, visible to anyone who walked past. I noticed the resort name, the dates, the luxury add-ons. I saw the airport shuttle booking, the all-inclusive package. He even bragged about the spa treatments he'd prepaid, and with every detail my plan sharpened. Still, the fear didn't go away. I kept asking myself, what if he finds out it was me? What if this backfires? What if I lose everything? But then I'd think about the alternative. Living the rest of my life knowing I let him take 20,000ers from me without a fight. Watching him return from Cabo, suntanned and smug, throwing little comments about how rest really boosts productivity. I couldn't stomach it. So I embraced the fear. I let it fuel me instead of paralyze me. I told myself this wasn't revenge. It was justice. I wasn't breaking the rules. I was making sure the rules finally applied to him. And the irony? The very systems he'd abused to steal from me would be the same ones I used to destroy his perfect vacation. Because if Mark thought he could weaponize company resources against me, he hadn't yet seen what would happen when I turned those same resources against him. That night, as I lay in bed, a plan began to crystallize. A way to cancel his trip, strand him in bureaucracy, and make sure every dollar he stole slipped right through his fingers. And for the first time in weeks, I fell asleep with a smile on my face. I didn't storm his office. I didn't send a dramatic email that would get me fired on the spot. I moved like I always had to at that company. Quietly, administratively, through paperwork and policy. If you want to take something from a man who believes rules don't apply to him, The smartest way is to make the rules do the work for you. First, allies. Dana from accounting was the one who'd slipped me the hint about the performance incentive line. I needed her more than she needed me. I reminded her of late nights she'd covered for me, of the time I'd walked her through a client reconciliation when she'd been swamped. I didn't ask for favors. I asked for facts. She gave them. "What you need is a hold," she said when I described how Mark had reclassified the bonus. "There's a place in the travel portal where we can flag suspicious bookings and require compliance review. It doesn't take much. Just show the expense lacks required sign-offs. The travel vendor freezes it until finance signs off." It sounded almost boring enough to be legal. I liked that. I wanted my actions to be boring, bureaucratic, as humiliating to him as his own smugness had been to me. Dana walked me through the forms, the exact verbiage to use that would trigger an automatic compliance workflow. She even told me which box to tick, so the internal auditor would get a red flag in their inbox. Once the auditors had something to chew on, they'd place holds, request documentation, and the travel agency would be instructed to pause anything tied to the company card. No mystery, no finger-pointing, just process. I spent the next 48 hours in a state that hovered somewhere between adrenaline and prayer. I created no forged documents. I didn't hack anything. I filled out a complaint as an employee filing a concern about an unexplained executive incentive allocation, and attached the public expense line that read, "Performance Incentive, $20,000, Cabo, Executive Wellness Retreat." I uploaded screenshots showing the booking confirmation and the dates. Dana told me to be patient. "Once compliance opens a review, it escalates," she said. "You don't want to be the person who looks petty. Let them do their job." I sat on my hands and let them. On Tuesday morning, 3 days before Mark's departure, my phone buzzed. It was a news update from HR, a mandatory reminder about expense policy. That felt like an odd coincidence until my inbox filled with a calendar invite. Compliance review, executive incentive allocation. Urgent. The organizer was the internal auditor, and the meeting was scheduled for the very next morning. It was the same wording the system used when it needed proof. It was also the system's polite way of pulling the emergency brake. Mark's behavior shifted like the weather before a storm. He stopped bragging long enough to send curt messages to the travel agency, then started CCing the CEO on emails titled, "Expedite Approval." I watched him move from breezy arrogance to clipped impatience. That was the first small victory. Arrogance that turned to fluster. The travel vendor called Mark's assistant. She left a message saying the corporate cardholder needed to supply a signed itinerary and final approval before they could issue the e-tickets. The hotel sent an automated note that the reservation was pending final confirmation and that upgrades would be held pending compliance clearance. The shuttle company emailed to say they'd tentatively reserved the van, but it wouldn't be confirmed without final payment authorization. I should have felt triumphant, and part of me did, but I felt something stranger too, a cold, nervous anticipation. Process takes time. Process reveals facts. Process forces people to produce paper that can be read by other people, including those who don't owe Mark favors. At 4:12 p.m., while I pretended to work through a client issue, Mark stormed out of a meeting and into the hallway. His voice carried. "Why is finance holding my trip? Who filed that complaint?" He banged on a conference room door when no one answered quickly enough. People turned heads. Some of them looked genuinely confused. Others looked away with the practiced caution of those who know when to keep their mouths shut. Donna texted me a short line. "They've opened an audit." Mark looked shredded. "Keep calm." I smiled in a way that felt equal parts relief and dread. The compliance review did its thing. It asked for documents no one could produce. A signed CEO authorization for a leadership wellness retreat, the policy for that scale of cost. Receipts showing pre-approved budget allocation. A clear business case signed by HR and the CFO. The travel vendor, obliged by corporate protocol, would not finalize any charges until the auditor closed the loop. The vendor's automated system had already converted the booking into a pending authorization, which for our purposes might as well read not happening yet. Mark's first instinct was to call the CEO and demand an override. He did. The CEO's assistant replied with an unusually terse, "We're reviewing." Another small victory. The person at the top had to pretend to be above the fray. Mark, used to using friendship leverage to cut corners, now had a friend who was forced by process to stay put. As the hours ticked by, Mark grew reckless. He yanked people into his office, raised his voice, and accused Dana of sabotage. Dana maintained a professional face, which made me love her more than I realized. She told him, calmly, quietly, that the auditor had flagged an unusual allocation and that the vendor had a hold pending documentation. She said it like she was reading a weather report and not dousing his parade in gasoline. Then the vendor emailed again, this one to the whole executive list. Due to pending compliance review on the corporate account, no final authorizations will be processed. Please supply required documentation within 24 hours to avoid automatic cancellation. 4 words in that email stung more than 1,000 angry screams could have. Automatic cancellation. He called the travel agent himself that night. I overheard the muffled conversation across the open plan office, his voice higher, faster. No, you don't understand. We need those tickets issued tonight." The agent replied in a tone I'd never heard him use with a client. "Sir, we're following corporate policy. If finance does not provide authorization, we cannot charge the account." For the first time since this began, Mark sounded frantic. That night he came in earlier than usual and walked past my desk with a look that could have been suspicion, could have been rage. He glanced at me briefly, then stalked away. I didn't flinch. I made coffee. I answered an email about a client deliverable. I stayed boring, administrative, procedural. I let the corporate machinery do what it did best, reveal the truth through its rules. The next morning, the executive inbox exploded. The auditor's invite had generated more requests for documentation than one man could supply without a magic wand. The CEO got copied, not out of friendship, but because the audit protocol required escalation. Counsel chimed in. HR wanted answers. My boss's poker face had dissolved. At 8:15 a.m., I watched Mark's calendar convert his outbound flight from confirmed to pending confirmation. By 9 a.m., the vendor sent the cancellation notice he had been bracing for. Reservation automatically canceled due to non-receipt of required authorization within 24 hours. He got a text from his wife shortly after. "They canceled the trip? What did you do?" He typed a response, hands shaking where I'd seen them steady for years. I almost felt a pang of pity. Almost. But then I thought about the long months I'd given up, the projects I'd saved, the nights I'd been on call while he took dinners with the CEO, and the pity vanished like cheap cologne. It wasn't instant victory. There were meetings, louder and more panicked than the previous whisper. He tried to spin blame. He threatened legal action. He demanded to know who filed the review. He asked the CEO to overrule. The CEO sighed and said something about process and governance that sounded like a rebuke and not a defense. Watching his empire wobble because of paperwork felt almost unfairly poetic. He'd built his protection on relationships and shortcuts. When the system asked for proper documentation, he had nothing but bravado. That evening, as Mark paced his office and spoke into his phone like a man trying to exhume a past favor, I sat at my desk and let a small smile rest on my lips. The trip was canceled. The margaritas were gone. The spa treatments evaporated. His tan would have to wait. And yet, even as relief cut through me like a cool breeze, I knew this was only Act 1 of a longer play. He'd been humiliated, yes, but he had power. He would lash out. He would try to rewrite the story. What I'd set in motion was legal and clean, but it had exposed a fragility I hadn't expected. Once the auditor's report landed on the CEO's desk, It would trigger questions about who authorized transfers and why. It wouldn't just be about a vacation anymore. It might become an investigation. My heart beat faster at the thought. I was no longer only trying to stop a trip. I had pulled a thread. Now I had to see what came unraveling on the other end. I shut my laptop, stood up, and walked past Mark's office as he glared into his phone, calling favors and making threats. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The system was doing the work I couldn't have done, shouting into a hallway. Tomorrow, I thought, would be when the real consequences started. The morning the cancellation became official, the entire floor felt different. The air was sharper, more alert, like the moment before a storm breaks. Mark strutted in late, sunglasses on, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, like he was already halfway to Cabo. He dropped it by his office door, whistling, smug as ever. 5 minutes later, his phone rang. I didn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. His voice carried every syllable sharper than the last. "What do you mean, canceled? No, recheck the reservation. It was confirmed. I paid for—" He stopped mid-sentence. His tan complexion paled. "Frozen, pending audit. Who authorized that?" The open floor froze. Everyone tried to look busy, but their ears were tuned like satellite dishes. A few exchanged glances, wide-eyed. For the first time, Mark's voice cracked, desperation bleeding through his usual arrogance. He slammed the phone down hard enough to rattle his glass desk. A few seconds later, he was storming through the hall, shoes echoing like gunshots. "Dana? Who filed that compliance hold? Who touched my account?" Dana didn't flinch. She had that cool accountant's tone that made everything sound like math. Compliance flagged it automatically. The system found a discrepancy between authorization and allocation. Mark sneered. "Bullshit, Hoot. Somebody triggered it." She tilted her head, expression calm. "That's how the system works, sir." He spun on his heel and barked into his phone again, trying to get the CEO. No luck. He tried the travel vendor. Stonewall. He even called the hotel directly, raising his voice until it broke into a half-yell. "I don't care what your system says. I am authorized." "Do you know who I am?" That was the moment, hearing him say it, panic creeping into the arrogance. I felt something inside me unclench. Months of humiliation, anger, betrayal, melting into satisfaction. He wasn't in control anymore. The rules he'd twisted were finally binding him. By noon, the emails started circulating. Official notices from compliance, CC'd to senior leadership. Unauthorized executive incentive expenditure under review. Associated travel bookings suspended pending investigation. He couldn't bury it. Couldn't spin it. His meltdown wasn't behind closed doors. It was in front of everyone. I'll never forget the look on his face when his wife called. He didn't take it in his office. He stood in the hallway, pacing, voice raised. "They canceled it. No, I don't know why. It's some stupid audit. Stop yelling at me. I said I'll fix it." He stopped, glancing up to see half the office staring. His jaw tightened, but the damage was done. His private humiliation had become a public spectacle, and the whisper started. "Wait, wasn't that supposed to be his own vacation? Did he really use someone else's bonus for that?" I heard it was compliance that froze it. That means they smelled something shady. The same people who had looked away when he paraded my stolen bonus were now circling like sharks. No one wanted to be close to a man whose power was crumbling. He tried to recover, of course. He slammed doors, barked orders, acted like it was a simple misunderstanding. But it was too late. The story was already out. His Cabo dream had gone up in smoke, and everyone knew it. That night, as I walked past his office, I saw him slumped in his chair, tie loosened, eyes bloodshot. The duffel bag was still by the door, untouched. His phone lit up with another angry call from his wife. He didn't answer. For the first time since I'd known him, Mark didn't look untouchable. He looked small, and standing there watching the man who stole my 20,000 unravel under the weight of his own arrogance, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Peace. But this wasn't over. The cancellation was just the beginning, because the audit had pulled a thread, and the whole sweater was starting to unravel. The audit didn't end with a canceled vacation. It grew teeth. 2 days later, compliance sent their report to senior leadership. It wasn't just about the $20,000. It was about a pattern. Unexplained incentives. Dubious client dinners billed at $700 per head. Travel receipts with no attached agendas. For years, Mark had been siphoning little luxuries into expense categories he thought no one would question. And maybe no one would have, if he hadn't gotten greedy enough to shove my bonus into Cabo. The CEO called an emergency meeting. Mark walked in, still trying to wear his armor, smiling, joking, brushing it all off as overzealous accountants. But when the CFO laid out the numbers, the laughter died. Line after line projected on the screen, each one proof of his entitlement, each one impossible to explain away. He tried. God, he tried. That was a client entertainment event. No client attended. That spa package was part of team wellness. No team member went with you. That hotel was for a strategic offsite. There's no agenda, no minutes, no invite list. Each denial tightened the noose. By the end of the meeting, he wasn't smiling anymore. He was pale, sweating, cornered, and the CEO, his golfing buddy, his shield, finally shook his head and said, "Mark, I can't cover for this. Not anymore." It was like watching a wall collapse. Within a week, he was placed on leave pending investigation. Within 2, the board announced his resignation to pursue other opportunities. But everyone knew the truth. He'd been forced out, stripped of the very power he used to humiliate me. The office shifted overnight. People who used to flinch at his footsteps now spoke openly, even laughed about him. Stories poured out, how he'd stolen credit for projects, manipulated expenses, bullied interns. I wasn't the only one he'd robbed. I was just the first one who'd finally tripped him. As for me, the audit traced every dollar. My bonus was reinstated, retroactive, deposited directly into my account. $20,000, exactly as promised. The number blinked on my screen, and for a moment I just stared, breath caught in my chest. It was real this time. Untouchable. Mine. I paid off my loans that week. I wired money to my mom, who cried when she saw the transfer. I fixed my car, filled the tank, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to check my bank balance before buying groceries. But the money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was watching karma work in slow motion. Seeing the man who thought he was invincible, brought down by his own arrogance. Seeing justice come not from shouting or revenge, but from the very rules he believed only applied to others. Sometimes, silence is the loudest weapon. The last time I saw him was weeks later, in the lobby. He wasn't wearing his expensive suits anymore. Just a wrinkled shirt, no tie, carrying a box of personal items. He didn't meet my eyes. He didn't smirk. He just kept walking, shoulders slumped, past the whispers of the employees he used to terrorize. I stood there, watching him leave, and I realized something. He had stolen my $20,000, but in trying to buy himself a vacation with it, he'd lost everything else. His job, his reputation, his safety net of power. And me? I got my dignity back. So if you've ever been screwed over by someone who thought they could get away with it, remember this. Power built on arrogance is fragile. All it takes is one crack, one push, one person who refuses to stay silent. Because eventually, karma comes. And sometimes you get to watch it happen in real time.